In 1990, what started as a passion project between Shozo Kaga and three other students employed in intelligent systems became Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon, and A Blade of Light. An unexpected late success for the Famicom that did well enough to warrant further creations for the series. After a mostly unrelated second entry with Fire Emblem Gaiden, the third entry in the series, Mystery of the Emblem, would be a direct sequel to that first game. Well, that was the extent of the original idea. Due to the small size of the original Fire Emblem 1 team, Kaga felt the finished product could have been better visually due to not being able to give as much effort towards the game's graphics. The third game, moving on to the Super Famicom, to them provided an excuse to create an improved remake of the first game, to see what it could be with their greater expertise and better hardware. This went as far as a moment when they were considering giving it its full standalone release rather than something just to bundle in with the sequel. Granted, it wasn't exactly unprecedented for NES or Game Boy games to get sequels on the Super Famicom without ports or remakes of older series entries, but it still made sense to include the original game in some capacity for first-time players. Most other games would usually opt for an opening text scroll or dumping it into the game's manual, so throwing in an outright remake I think is representative of their commitment to a refined, quality product. Either way, what they managed to come up with worked. Mystery of the Emblem considerably outdid the previous two entries in the series, and to this day is considered an essential classic for the Super Famicom by Japanese players. When you say Mystery of the Emblem to Western fans of the series, however, in my experience they'll jump to thinking about the sequel, the second half of the cartridge titled War of Heroes, or simply Book 2. Meanwhile, we've never seen any official efforts to translate Mystery of the Emblem, and due to the series' declining sales numbers at the time, the 2010 DS remake, New Mystery of the Emblem, ended up not being localized at all. In short, there's never been as much demand for seeing the first part of the Arcanea duology as the second for international players. I myself went from playing Shadow Dragon on the DS straight into Book 2 without much thought towards Book 1. Basically just because I didn't have a way to play New Mystery at the time and I just wanted to see the sequel. Considering how little I find about it online otherwise, this initial remake of the first game, Book 1 of Mystery of the Emblem, seems to be pretty overlooked by international audiences. Is it just because the West has had other, more accessible options for experiencing this game's story? Is there something a bit more to it? Well, let's find out. We're gonna look at a full playthrough of the game, and just for fun, we're committing to no resets, so losses are permanent, just as Kaga intended. Since this game never got an official English release, I'm going to be playing with a fan translation. I'm also going to be covering the game in a lot of depth, so turn back now if you want to play the game yourself and would rather do so blind. With that out the way, let's begin. Starting a new save, you'll get the game's backstory. I'm not going to be focusing on the story too much, but to catch up those unfamiliar, decades after his previous defeat, the Earth Dragon Medius revives, and with allied nations Grust and Macedon, conquers most of the continent. Most importantly, they kill the Kingdom of Arcanea's royal family, besides its Princess Nina, who is allowed to escape to Aurelis by Grust's General Camu. Following betrayal from the neighboring nation Gra, the Prince of Altea, Marth, and a small entourage managed to escape, afforded by his sister Alice's capture and his parents' deaths. As the descendant of Vanri, who had slain Medius years before, he spends the following 2 years in the island nation of Talis, training to retake his home, rescue his sister, and defeat Medius once more. So, here's Chapter 1. Talis' Princess Sheeta seeks Marth's assistance to repel a sudden pirate invasion, which is nothing out of the ordinary for the series, but it's the first one, so I guess that stands to reason. The basics of Fire Emblem are pretty much all here, color-coded guys with numbers on a grid. You might notice the lack of the series' usual blue movement grid. Here it just highlights where you can go and dulls everything else. Looking into the menus, you'll also notice that units have separate inventories for items and weapons, something Path of Radiance would also do later on. It's a little bit quirky, with separate trade commands for each inventory, but compared to the original game, navigating menus is a massive improvement. Unit stats also work pretty much how you'd expect them to if you've played any other game in the series. Strength affects your damage output, skill affects your accuracy and crit rate, the works. There are a few points worth noting though, firstly the weapon level stat. Unlike most later games having a letter rank, something kept in the original is weapon level being a numbered stat that your units can gain on level up. The unit in question is able to use any weapons with requirements at or below their weapon level stat, which you will almost never notice be a relevant restriction because most weapons have a pretty low requirement. A second note is resistance. Unlike being effectively a status or class bonus like the last two games, resistance is a real stat that you can get on level up. And it's a 3% growth on every unit that can level it, and no one has any more resistance than their class base when you get them. Why did they do it this way? No idea, but it's some fun when your unit happens to get that 3% to work in their favor. Lastly, there's nothing like build or constitution, so weapon weight comes straight out of the unit speed stat with no mitigation. Anyway, let's talk about Marth. He's the Lord, so you kinda have to use him. He doesn't have quite as much going for him as the first game, but he's still the most important unit you have. A lot of actions like seizing and visiting villages can only be done by him, so the strategic emphasis of the game is on how well you can navigate in between points of interest in tandem with the rest of the army and effectively using limited resources. Fortunately, since he's very centralizing, they thought to make him competent. He's got pretty reasonable growth rates despite relatively low bases, especially compared to a lot of other units, though he'll likely still appreciate some stat boosters later on since, unlike other units, he doesn't promote. Sheena's really good. She's the only flying unit you'll have for a solid stretch of the game, and has enough weapon level to use higher end weapons basically immediately. You will also need her specifically for some stuff later on like recruitments, so there's really very little reason to not use her. Lastly, we have Gordon. He's stuck in Archer, which is kind of bad. For some reason it has the same movement restrictions as Armor Knights, so it can't even cross some tiles like Forests at all. His growth's aren't even all that amazing, but I decided it would be funny to use him, so he's on the team. Anyway, the map proceeds with more or less no problems. Strog and Jagen can handle pretty much everything coming their way, and the others are able to easily swoop in for picking up kills. There's also two villages you'll want to visit. The first gives you a huge stack of cash. I recommend stocking up on a few swords and javelins at the armory. Later on there's a second village, which of course gives you a vulnerary. So to cram two campaigns into one Super Famicom cartridge, they had to cut out some parts of the original, and the first casualty of that we see is Reese. The cutting room floor lists him and the other missing units still having IDs in the game, just being unused. Either way, I guess take the vulnerary with you, and you'll be very glad you did. The boss of the map is no real problem. He didn't bring a ranged weapon, so you can just toss javelins and shoot arrows at him with no real concern besides missing enough of a castle to heal him up. Once he's down, Marth can seize, and then gets told that he's ready to set out, and leaves for the mainland. Moving on to Chapter 2, let's start with the 4 units you get when the map starts. Ogma is a mercenary, and he's pretty good. Most of your units at this point will be weighed down too much by their weapons to double attack, but Ogma will have no such problem, and he has pretty good damage output on top of it. The same can't be said, however, for the trio of idiots he brought with him. So here's the 3 guys from that one Smash Bros. Spirit, Bast, Ward, and Cord. These 3 units are the first, second, and last playable axe users in the game. That sounds like a cool niche until you remember that thing I said earlier about how weapon weight is taken directly out of your speed with nothing like build to reduce it. Axes in particular are way too heavy to reasonably allow them to double. As an example, an iron sword has 3 weight and a steel sword has 4. An iron axe has 7 weight and a steel axe has 9. There's also no weapon triangle in this game, so there's basically no tactical benefit to using them. Bast is the best of the 3 if you really want to use one of them, but he's still pretty heavily kneecapped by Fighter not getting a promotion in this game, and subsequently no promotion bonuses. If you're familiar with Arcanea, you might have noticed I mentioned only 3 axe units. Yeah, Daros was another unit that didn't make the cut. Ordinarily he'd be a recruitable enemy that you talk to with Marth in the upper right corner of the map, but he's just completely absent. Anyway, we're still early, so the maps aren't that demanding yet. Ogma and Drag will be able to handle a bit more punishment than the others, so I usually have the latter block off the thieves and pirates in the upper corner. This is also the first map where you'll see enemy cavaliers, which Marth will dispatch easily with the rapier. They're not super threatening outside of their movement range. You'll probably also notice a non-boss enemy with a portrait. That would be Castor, the first of a handful of units you'll need Cheetah to recruit. He's a hunter, which is basically Archer with more mobility. That sounds good when I put it like that, but it comes with a trade-off I'll come back to later on. Once you're done hitting up the village, there's not much else to do but seize and move on. So, before anything else, you've been listening to this game's map theme so far. That's theme, singular. The final map gets a different theme, but you might want to swap off of the game's audio for your own music around now if you're not as huge on it. Anyway, Chapter 3, Marth's pushing through some bandit-filled mountains, and a couple of them are willing to mutiny. This map has something of two fronts going on. A couple units are going to be escaping from the upper right down to where your group starts, and Marth's naturally going to be pushing over to the castle. Two of the units you get on this map will join immediately. Julian is a thief, allowing him to open chests and doors without a key. Like Marth, he doesn't get a promotion, but given he's mostly here to fill a utility role, it doesn't matter too much. Next to him is Lena. She's now the first healer you get since Reese didn't survive the snap. She's another unit you're probably going to be using for at least a little bit regardless, just because she's the only one serving that function. She doesn't have a healing staff on join since you'll need to get it back from the map's boss, but she does come with a warp staff. Warp is at its most cracked in Arcanea due to its infinite range, being able to move a unit anywhere on the map. As you might expect, it enables a lot, and you'll need to take care to use it as effectively as possible. Lena does also get a cool unique bonus later on, so she's worth keeping around. Lastly, Sheeta can talk to Navarre, who is chasing down Julian to recruit him. He's another mercenary, and while he's not on Ogma's level, he joins early enough to pull some weight. I decided to add him to the squad because why not? Once you seize, you'll be given the startling revelation that this old guy called Malidus has been with us all along as an advisor, who hands you yet another assload of money that the bandits left behind. Spooky. Marth now moves to meet with Hardin, which is a bit fast, you might be thinking. Yeah, so not only did some units get cut, but not all the maps made it either. Ordinarily you'd be doing Battle in the Lee right now, but since space had to be made, it didn't make the cut, and we go right past it into what would be Chapter 5 in the other versions of the game. The units you get on the cut maps that didn't get removed basically just got shuffled around into the surrounding ones to accommodate, the first of those being Merrick, who's now holed up in this village at the start as opposed to a village in Battle of the Lee. Mages also actually use their attack stat in this game instead of tomes doing fixed damage, though the growths in it are pretty low on average, so you might want to toss them an energy ring for it just so they one round consistently later on. Your main task this map is getting your main squad over to back up Hardin's group across the river. Like a couple of the earlier maps, you can just put someone in position on the bridge and wait out any initial enemy waves before making advances. As for the fresh blood, Hardin's pretty good. He's pretty easily the best option for another cavalier at this point in the game. There's really not much else compelling about his loser squad. Roche's fine, I think, but I didn't use him, and the others, exist. You'll maybe also want to bring Lena to this map to pick up her brother on the enemy side, Mathis, another relocated unit from Battle in the Lee. He's also not very good, so you're probably not losing much or just skewering him and being done with it. Make sure you grab this Firestone from the village as well. It's a surprise tool that will help us later. Once you seize, you'll be told there are still some enemies inside the castle, and the next map will move indoors. Alright, I've been putting it off long enough. This version of the game does have one significant mechanic that the others lack, that being the series' first showing of dismounting. Your horseback and flying units can get off their mount and fight on foot. Whilst dismounted, units take a stat penalty, become locked into using swords instead of lances if that was their weapon type, and lose movement type weaknesses like flying units losing their weakness to bows. On indoor maps, however, your mounted units are forced into dismounting, so for Chapter 5 you'll want to adjust your mounted units of choice to have swords available if they don't already. Suffice to say, this mechanic is weird. While there aren't enough indoor maps to where your cavaliers aren't worth using long term, they sorta just become worse versions of your mercenaries on them. If you remember what I said about Hunter being worse than Archer, it's because Horseman, its promotion, just reverts to Hunter on indoor maps, so Sniper ends up overall better despite Archer being kinda lame. Losing the mounted mobility sucks, but the weapon change is the most annoying part to me, since now part of your inventory has to account for doing something dismounted, even if you pretty rarely want to as is. Chapter 5 itself, anyway, doesn't change all too much despite the addition of dismounting. Your main goal here, besides the typical seize, is to stop a load of thieves escaping with treasure from the chests. Fortunately, a positive change from the original game is thieves will hold on to what they steal instead of, I assume, eating it, so it's more just stopping them escaping rather than making a mad dash for every chest. You can pretty easily just block off their escape point by warping Draug or Jaeger up to the doorway at the top and then go about the rest of the map at your leisure. You'll also get a couple more recruits at the start. Rickard, who is whatever, and Wendell, who's the greatest of all time. The boss here is the first promoted boss in the game, a general. He doesn't pack a ranged weapon, so he's pretty easy to handle with Merrick and or Wendell. Ending the map, Marth gets the Fire Emblem from Princess Nina, which is basically an infinite-use chess key permanently occupying one of his item slots. Chapter 6 puts you against the Macedonian Dragoons' leader, Minerva. Don't worry too much about her or her named cohorts, they're not too into fighting you and will leave after a couple turns. Make sure you get the village in a town within the mountain range, as this will recruit Bantu to your side. He's a Manakete, the series staple race of dragons. He doesn't come with anything, but if you got that Firestone earlier, he can use it to assume his dragon form. So, most time Manaketes or dragons turn up in the series, the Dragonstone is basically functionally identical to any other weapon. Mystery of the Emblem, however, has entirely different mechanics with them, as they now function as an item. Using a Dragonstone as an item on the map will transform Bantu into a fire dragon for a few turns, drastically boosting his stats and giving him a defense-piercing 1-2 range attack. This transformation will hold for a few turns, and eventually he'll revert to humanoid form. This does have the downside of losing out on some turns as you have to spend them transforming, but it does mean you get a theoretically greater amount out of the Dragonstones than the other games where one use of it is strictly one attack. This is a cool change, I think. It maintains the usual element of Dragonstone uses being a limited resource that you have to commit to, but without it feeling as pressing as like, I have exactly 30 attacks to not waste with this thing. I wouldn't mind seeing them do this again. Chapter 7 is the first map of an arena. If you know how it functions in the Game Boy Advance games, it's the same deal. You place a wager on winning a fight, earn back double if you win, and die if you lose. You can use it to level or money grind if you want, but generally speaking it's not necessary. You'll rarely be short on funding or EXP, so only go for it if you really like grinding, I guess. Besides that, all that's really going on is Marth running past Black Friday crowds. After this map you'd ordinarily take a detour over to Parathi, but since it was pretty much filler anyway, it was one of the maps that got removed, so instead Katria comes in to tell you that Minerva's ready to make a clean break from working with Dola. This is a pretty big map where you have the additional objective of rescuing Minerva's sister, Maria, who's stuck in prison as a bargaining chip to secure Minerva's compliance. You'll want to be quick about getting into the prison, as eventually reinforcements will approach from behind you. For some reason, the prison isn't considered indoors, and you don't have to dismount inside it, so there's that at least. Minerva will also approach you as an enemy, but generally just float a bit outside of your range. You don't need to worry about her unless you attack her for some reason. You can rescue Maria by opening her cell and having her talk to Marth. Once she's rescued, Minerva will start approaching Marth and talk to him when she can. Minerva is another very solid unit. She comes in with a speed wing that can go to anyone, but really just having her use it herself will ensure her long-term relevance. This is also the first map with a promotion item, that being a hero crest. After Ogma duels for the right, I have him use it and promote into hero. The hero promotion games are comparatively tame considering other classes, but they make Ogma a force to be reckoned with even more than he already was. Speaking of, generally you'll want to promote as soon as possible in this game. Since all stats besides HP max out at 20 and promotion gains are kinda high overall, you're pretty much always better off taking it sooner than later. If you really need it, stat boosters are also absurd. That speedwing I just gave Minerva, that's plus 5 speed, like actually just a quarter of the stat cap. With Minerva in tow, the group moves to retake Arcanea. For this map, you'll need to be keeping the ballisticians around the castle in mind when maneuvering your units, particularly your flying ones. Since, as mentioned, Parathi was skipped, this is now your first exposure to an enemy Manakete. He can be pretty scary if you're not careful since Dragon Breath ignores defense, so if you have to tank him, make sure it's with your higher HP units. I drew him out with the new recruit George, and then had Gordon and Ogma beat him up. On your way to take the castle, these forts also put out reinforcements, so moving your units to cover them is not a bad idea. Chapter 10 is inside the castle, and one of your tasks is breaking imprisoned Arcanean knights out of jail. Naturally, you're once again forced to dismount. Compared to Chapter 5, I'd find it a bit more annoying. The lack of mounted mobility you have in the other versions feels a lot more glaring by comparison here. Warp can help as always, but unlike last map, I ended up not using it here even though I probably should have. The imprisoned group are pretty whatever, use them if you need rolls filmed after losses or something, I guess. You will need MIDI and next map to recruit another unit, Astrum, but that's about it. Besides all the loot in the treasure room, there's one last chest in the lower right of the map that contains the boots, a one-off stat booster that gives you +4 to movement. Marth needs to be places, so naturally I want them on him as soon as possible. Due to an unexpected crit shenanigan, Abel almost dies, but he doesn't, so it's fine. Finishing the map, you'll also be given Parthia, one of the Regalia weapons. It's a bow with a lot of power behind it, and also doubles your EXP gain when you have it equipped, something that will be valuable to Gordon in the near future. We skip over the wooden cavalry and move into taking the fight to Gra, as it's most likely they're currently in possession of Falchion, the sort of Moth's bloodline, that would give him a fighting chance against Medius. After much mediocrity, Gordon was finally able to promote with the Orion's Bolt obtained from the last map, finally making him not a total liability. This is, also, the first hybrid indoor-outdoor map in the game, so you'll have to manually dismount your units to let them enter the throne room if they're mounted. Which, as an aside, if there are combination indoor-outdoor maps, why is the game so inconsistent about it? Like, Maria's prison was ostensibly indoors looking when it wasn't, and this treasure room and throne room don't feel that distinct by comparison to them, so I can only assume Kaga intended to confuse and perplex. The boss here is Geel, the guy who betrayed Moth's dad a few years ago. He's kinda just a general and doesn't put up too much of a fight against whatever magic or effective weapons you can throw at him. I decided to take some time out to level up some of my lower level units against this map's Pegasus reinforcements. Due to a misclick shenanigan, Hardin almost dies, but he doesn't, so it's fine. The next idea is that Garneth, Medius' acolyte, has Falchion hidden away, so the group ventures out into the Kadain Desert to see if they can get it back. On account of his Imhulu magic, you cannot defeat Garneth as it makes him completely invulnerable to attacks. Your best odds of surviving against him are pretty much taking the highest resistance unit you have, giving them a boost with Barrier or a Pure Water, and then having them just stand on the right bridge. You won't have to keep it up forever, as after a few turns he leaves and taunts you to come and find him in Thebes if you want Falchion. Admittedly, this is one of the more just there parts of the game. It's not terrible, but considering the central draw of the map is Garneth, who leaves pretty quickly, there's not much else going on besides being slowed down by a desert. While I don't think Kadain is a shining example, the map design in this game on the whole is pretty good. Granted, that's more of a compliment to the original Famicom game. Outside of dismounting and the moved units, generally speaking, things are pretty much one-to-one to the original maps. The game's pretty good at pressuring you on side objectives like thieves and/or villages, and enemies can pretty consistently provide a reasonable threat in formations. Maps are also generally pretty reasonable in their scope. Few, if any, feel like a slog, or that they overstay their welcome. Good balance is stuck between having varied terrain without continually bogging you down behind endless trees or sand, and while the game does have a fair number of reinforcements, they're usually not uncontrollable or difficult to stop. These games do have something of a reputation for how powerful warp is and how soon you get it, but to dismiss the entire game as warp skip does feel a little bit unfair considering both the map design's overall competence and the necessity of having units to warp skip, as well as considering the resources you trade off for not playing the map straight. Following the scuffle with Garneth, Moth gets facetimed by yet another senior citizen, this being the White Sage Goto. To beat Garneth, he'll need the Tome Starlight, which Goto can make for him if he brings him 2 orbs, the Star Sphere and Light Sphere. Before then, however, he returns to Altea to liberate his homeland. Altea's map sends you 2 ways, the long way around to handle a squad of cavaliers and some villagers, and the other through a guarded prison, which is also not indoors, but if it was, it'd be such a huge momentum killer, so like it's fine, I guess. There's a couple interesting notes here. You get a mutually exclusive choice between the hero Samson or paladin Aaron, and there's also Zane, the one freelancer in the game. He transforms like a Manakete, but into a copy of one of your other units. It's a pretty interesting gimmick that they've somehow never tried again since. Of course, your task is to flush out the indoor forces on the subsequent map. The enemies are led by the game's first mage dragon, who is primarily defined by having an ass ton of resistance and hence being immune to magic. He claims to have killed Moth's mother, but apparently his sister is being kept elsewhere at Garneth's request. Anyway, welcome to Moth's map from Engage. You'll want to be pretty careful around the boss store. He's backed up by swarm users that can do pretty significant damage to your lower res units. Additionally, you'll want to pay attention to these bishops in the corner as one drops the VIP card, giving you access to a handful of secret shops across the rest of the game, the first of which is behind the throne. The first secret shop is pretty much the only time you'll get easy access to a few things like Shaver, a weaker but non-Merrick exclusive Excalibur, as well as stuff like physics staves for ranged healing, so just pick up what you think you'll need. Once again, we skipped another map that the intro narration has to accommodate. This time it was the Sable Order, where you'd be going toe-to-toe with a group of Kamu's soldiers. Interestingly, the map is still in the game because it's also the map for Chapter 8 of Book 2. Kinda weird, but they had to cut some maps, and I guess this was one of the better choices. Anyway, for this one you'll need to lock in. This map contains the Star Sphere and Light Sphere, the two MacGuffins that you need to successfully bring to Goto if you want to be able to beat Garneth, as some thieves are scone with them if you're not fast enough. The boss of the map is Tiki, who's been brainwashed by Garneth. She's a divine dragon and has overall a much higher ceiling than Bantu, of whom can also entirely avoid fighting her by overcoming her brainwashing to add her to your ranks. If you just can't go without a dragon, she's a very good choice. You're not going to have to trade off the Star Sphere and Light Sphere for a little bit, so while you have them, make full use of them. The Light Sphere is alright, it allows the holder to ignore enemy terrain bonuses, crits, and effective damage, but the real attraction is the Star Sphere. Any unit holding the Star Sphere will not only have infinite weapon durability, but also get a 30% boost to all their growth rates. This becomes even better if you remember Parthia from earlier, which also gives you double EXP on top of having the destructive force of a bazooka. So while it isn't as efficient, I spend the latter half of the map opening doors to reveal any enemies inside rooms, and then having Gordon obliterate them. He is now my strongest soldier. Look at those numbers. He still wants a speed wink, actually. Even though in this version of the game you off-screen his loser squad, we still have to actually fight Kamu for real, despite how much Nina doesn't want us to. Now, you might have thought, man, setting aside those near misses, this run's been going pretty well. I have great news. It is about to become so much worse on account of my own greed and ineptitude and nothing else. So, Kamu himself occupies the fort on the top left, but there's a village towards the bottom past some ballistas and paladins. Getting down there is quite useful, as the guy there gives you the Hammer and Staff, a staff exclusive to Lena that lets you repair weapons to their maximum number of uses. Unique to this version of the game, however, you also immediately recruit Est after visiting this village, the last of the 3 Pegasus Knights. More importantly, she brings with her Mercurius, the Regalia sword. Like Parthia, it's very strong, doubles its wielder's EXP gain, and makes for a very powerful combination with the Star Sphere. You do have to beat a thief to the village regardless, so getting there is worth prioritizing, but I was playing this game just off of memory, and one thing I did remember from playing the game previously was reinforcements coming from the 2 sets of forts. I quickly had my more capable units get in position to block the upper forts, and kinda just left the enemies from the lower forts to approach me. I wanted some Star Sphere levels on a few of my units, mostly Astrum and the now promoted Sheeta, after the last map finally gave her an Elysian Whip. And like, they're unpromoted Knights and Archers, really not that threatening. As you might expect of engaging enemies on a mostly open field without cover, this would prove to be a critical mistake, and my units quickly get pressured by their sheer numbers. Unfortunately, Astrum draws a lot of fire, and ultimately takes one stray hit too many, and dies. God damn it. Not wanting there to be a second casualty and noticing that the south forts stopped putting out enemies, I pull my other units off the upper forts for crisis control. So you can imagine the sheer terror I felt when Grust arrived appeared after I ended my turn. The first guy runs into Wendell, who dodges the hit and returns fire, taking a kill but only opening himself up to further attacks. The second, however, targets Lena, who can't retaliate, but she avoids the hit. The third also goes for her. Another miss. The final Cavalier takes that shot at her, and once more, misses. Fortunately, after this, the Horde becomes a lot more manageable, and the rest of the map proceeds without much issue. It sucks to have lost a unit after a mostly good run this late, but at least it wasn't someone more important, I guess. It would have actually just been far better to open the bridge sooner and use that as a choke point, or maybe just actually use something other than hazy memory for when reinforcements are supposed to stop. Either way, all I can do now is move on. Near Kamu, you'll notice another general with a portrait, Lorenz, who you can recruit with Sheeta. He is a late-game filler unit, and I guess I just had a position vacated. Now for what we're really here for. Despite his love for Nina, he cannot bring himself to abandon his homeland, and hence this can only end in blood. Kamu brought Gradivus to the function, and he's pretty scary for it, posing a very intimidating mixed-range threat. Fortunately, I brought the perfect opponent, another blonde man. Ogma has felled many foes up to now, but at last he is a worthy opponent. We are about to witness— oh, he won already. One key player in the war down, and Marth jumps right into handling another because we're skipping over one more map. Ordinarily you'd fight a load of Macedonian Dragoons first, but we're now against Minerva's brother, Michaelis, who killed their dad and is now king. You know, as a quick aside, while I do think the right choices were made overall for which maps to cut from the game, not having them does kinda remove some anticipation in these later parts. Unlike Kamu, who was pretty content to stay where he was, Michaelis has no qualms with just rushing right towards you and leaving his castle to one of his generics, so most of the map is going to be fought in this canyon pass. Michaelis, despite the Iota shield he's holding to null flyer effectiveness, won't be a match for a trained up mage or Parthia user, so outside of his movement range on enemy phase, he won't be too much of a threat. What is a threat is my own stupidity. Due to paying too slowly and a surprise reinforcement shenanigan, Samson actually dies, which he did, so well. You'll also want to visit this secret shop. Ordinarily it would have been on the last map that got cut. This one sells promotion items. Anyone you're using that hasn't yet promoted will want to grab an item from here. Like, no joke, you've had all of one bishop ring this entire game up until this point, so Lena and Lind have still been running around in their base class while Merrick's been strutting with his fancy unique bishop sprite for a couple maps now. The DS game kind of addressed this with having master seals instead of class-specific items, though granted that was more to accommodate the addition of reclassing rather than patching up how late some promotion items are. Lastly, before seizing, you'll want to have Marth take the spheres to this village. If you have them, Goto will trade them for Starlight, a reasonably powerful tome that's also the key to defeating Garneth. Goto gives the group a leg up in reclaiming Falchion and rescuing Alice by teleporting them all to Fabes. Interestingly, this is the single map in the entire game that has a substantially altered layout from the original. Instead of the winding staircase corridor, we now have this. Unlike the other versions, there's no guessing games involved, as despite having copies, the true Garneth is pretty obviously the one holding him Hulu at the back. If you don't have Starlight, you'll sorta just have to navigate Marth around him to seize since he'll be invincible. If you do have Starlight, it's pretty easily done to beat him even with a subpar mage, since Hulu ends up obliterating Garneth's speed, so doubling him is not difficult. Doing so will net you the Falchion, an infinite use dragon effective sword exclusive to Marth and the best weapon against Medius. Yeah, I have to be honest, for being the only entirely distinct map layout in the game, this is kinda lame. After that, Goto will put you right outside Dolor Keep, Medius' final stronghold. The end is in sight. Take now to restock any weapons you'll need. Most of the enemies on this map are dragons, so be very careful about your positioning. It's tempting to just rush straight over to the forts with Vulcan and waltz in, but there is one thing you might want to do before doing so. At the start of the map, you'll have Alice, Marth's sister. Like Lena, she also has unique access to a staff, that being Alm, which is a one-time staff that will revive a dead unit. The catch is she has to do it in front of this shrine, so it's not exactly a flawless one-off revival. There's also the final secret shop in this corner of the map, selling basically every stat booster in the game short of the boots. I'd spend the remainder of my money buying angelic robes, energy rings, and Draco shields for a few members of the army, making sure they'll be at their best for the end of the game. Not much had to go to Ogma though. Look at this man. Raw gains. He didn't even use the Star Sphere all that much. This is it, our final battle. Your army will be split 4 ways when they enter, so you might want to restart the map and readjust who's in what deploy slot until you get a decent formation. I didn't, so now I'm simply having to work with the upper corner, putting a lot of pressure on Minerva to cover Lena and Wendell, while the upper right corner is completely fine on account of the Gods Among Men Gordon and Ogma. Marth's group at the bottom of the map would also start with Goto as a free final map unit, but unfortunately he wound up being the final cut unit. As you might expect, you're gonna have to regroup your army before storming Medius' throne room, which for some reason is also different in this version. This proceeds to go swimmingly, as Lena narrowly avoids death to a hero, and Harden comically fails to do likewise after he gets blasted by a Thoron crit. I don't want to talk about it. Once you manage to break your units through the rooms, doors will lock behind them, trapping whoever's still in there. I wind up having to burn one of my spare warp uses on sending Julian to go and free Minerva from being burned to death by a mage dragon. There are reinforcements on this map, but they're not frequent and most spawn quite far away from you, so they're not huge concerns. You'll also want to keep the Meteor Tome Bishop to Medius' side in mind as you approach, because he kills Lawrence with another crit. Yeah, okay, sure, whatever, I guess. Before long, you'll be face to face with Medius. Most units attacking into him will suffer half strength, but if you've got Falchion, it shouldn't be an issue. Let's go. With that, the war is over. With Nina's encouragement, Marth and Cheetah confess their feelings to each other, and plan to rebuild Altea at each other's side. All in all, this is an interesting piece of Fire Emblem's history, and easily the most different iteration of the War of Shadows we've been given. That said, for as many good changes as it makes a few more interesting ones. While I don't think it's necessarily a massive downside, I admittedly find dismounting more of an inconvenience than much else of how it interacts with usable weapons and the pace of a couple maps. The missing maps admittedly aren't a huge obstacle, as they generally had less narrative impact, though I'd prefer to have them than not. Would I recommend it? I think if you're only going to play the Marth games once, you're still better off going with the DS version, both for being a bit closer to what you'd be used to if you're coming off of the franchise's newer entries, and also because that version doesn't have anything cut from the Famicom original, and still has some added extras if you choose to pursue them. For more avid or long-time fans, even though I will vouch for the game overall, I still kinda struggle to see it as more of a novelty compared to the other versions of the game. Like, it's different, and that's kind of the entire draw to me, I guess. I'd say go for it if it appeals to you similarly, or if you find the Famicom one a bit too archaic for your liking. If you were to ask me where I'd put Book 1 on the tier list, it'd probably be something like a lower-end B tier. Even though I showed off most of the game already, there's still plenty of room for player expression, so don't let it stop you giving it a shot yourself if you're interested. If you can handle a little bit of Japanese, the game is available on Nintendo Switch Online if you have a Japanese account, and the game was also included on the Super Famicom Mini Classic Edition in Japan as well, but that's about as good as you're getting for modern re-releases of the game. If you made it here, then thank you for watching to the end. This video was something of an experiment, and hopefully it turned out well enough. Maybe I'll do something about Book 2 or another game in the future. Have a good one.